It was the bell that first unsettled me. Not the sound itself, but the timing. A faint, deliberate toll at 7:30 to a moment when no service was scheduled, no prayer intended. Oxford mornings are full of half-heard bells, some calling to worship, some merely confused by age or mechanism, but this one had a tone too resolute to be an accident. I remember pausing by the newsstand near Broad Street, the pages of the Oxford Mail fluttering like nervous wings, and thinking how rarely a bell means what it claims to. Later that morning, the paper confirmed my suspicion. An obituary of sorts tucked between a council notice and a lost dog appeal. Mrs. Della Craythorne, matron of St. Agatha's College, had died suddenly in her office. Natural causes, said the coroner's note, though the line that followed no sign of struggle caught my attention like a misprint in a crossword. People rarely struggle when the real battle is inward. St. Agatha's was a place I'd always regarded with mild curiosity. A women's college that had resisted modernity longer than most, its stone walls a shade too proud of their silence. Lewis drove us there after lunch, the drizzle blurring the windshield in gentle protest. He talked about football as he often did when the air felt heavier than the facts. I listened only half-heartedly, my thoughts circling the word matron. A role of order, not affection, a custodian of habits rather than hearts. When we arrived, the college lay folded in quiet like a letter never sent. The porter greeted us with the caution of a man who has learned that grief prefers whispers. He led us through a quadrangle that smelled faintly of moss and candle smoke. The matron's office was just off the main corridor, a narrow room lined with ledgers and the faintest trace of lavender polish. She sat there, still hands folded, eyes closed, a cup of tea cooling by her side. The cup itself was delicate, bone china with a pale blue rim, as if chosen for someone gentler than she. Lewis cleared his throat, muttering something about heart failure. I noticed the teaspoon beside the saucer was absent. Not misplaced, but missing altogether. The smallest things always take leave first. I leaned closer. The tea bore the faint scent of herbs, not the usual brand of English breakfast, but something subtler, medicinal perhaps. And there was a crumb on her cuff, as if she'd been interrupted mid-motion. A life paused, not concluded. The nurse on duty, a spare woman with eyes too sharp for her profession, insisted Mrs. Craythorne had seemed well that morning. A little quiet, she said, which struck me as redundant. People rarely become quiet by halves. I asked whether the bell had rung often without cause. She shook her head, only once that morning, a slip of a hand perhaps, or an echo waiting to be understood. Lewis was already making notes, his pencil steady, his patience remarkable. He asked about the college routine, about staff, visitors, deliveries. I watched the light shift across the matron's face, wondering why stillness sometimes looks so smug. Death, in certain rooms, seems to imitate control. I thought of my own mornings, the tea that cooled beside a neglected crossword, the headlines that rarely changed anything except mood. There was something familiar, almost domestic, in the scene before me. And yet it hummed with unease. As we left, I lingered at the doorway. A framed notice board displayed the weekly rota, laundry times, kitchen orders, chapel duties, each note written in the same firm, slanted hand. The last entry, half erased, read, "Inspection postponed." No date, no reason, a cancellation or a warning. I couldn't tell which. Outside, the rain had turned to mist. St. Agatha's spires dissolved into the grey, like memories reluctant to stay formed. Lewis asked whether I thought it was natural causes. I said perhaps, though nature has been known to use rather unnatural tools. He smiled, uncertain whether to take it as jest or judgment. Back at the car, I glanced once more toward the bell tower. The rope hung still, dampened by the fog, but I could almost imagine the faint echo of that morning toll. Bells are curious things. They announce both beginnings and ends, yet the sound is the same. Somewhere between the first chime and the last, a truth waits to be recognized if one has the patience to listen. There are rooms in Oxford that seem to have absorbed too much silence. St. Agatha's was built of such quiet, thick, well-fed, and faintly judgmental. The corridors smelled of beeswax and bygone sermons. I have never trusted silence. It hides the noises we cannot bear to name. Lewis said the place reminded him of a convent, which was not far from the truth. The college had been founded for the education of ladies of modest means and moral fortitude. The phrase appeared on a brass plaque by the porter's lodge, greened by rain and irony. Della Craythorne had guarded that creed as if the world outside were forever on the brink of moral collapse. In the warden's office we met Dr. Leonora Vale Slender, composed, a kind of beauty that looked borrowed from discipline. She offered tea. Lewis accepted. I did not. Her hands were too steady. I distrusted steadiness in anyone who dealt with death. She spoke of Mrs. Craythorne with the faint smile of an academic giving a eulogy to a theory she had once believed in, but no longer defended. A pillar of the college, she said, tireless, incorruptible, words that I have found usually precede discovery of some small, unforgivable sin. When I asked about the morning of the matron's death, Leonora paused, just a fraction too long. She had been in the chapel, she said. The bell had startled them. She thought it might have been one of the porters, though she did not say which. Then, almost absently, she added that Della's duties had become more selective of late. A euphemism, I assumed, for losing interest in the living. The college nurse, Mrs. Blight, appeared next, a pale wraith of starch and efficiency. She spoke in the vocabulary of routine blood pressure, medication, scheduled rest. I asked whether the matron had suffered from heart trouble. None recorded, she replied. Then, lowering her voice, she mentioned that Mrs. Craythorne had been more troubled recently with some disagreement with the young librarian, a girl named Claire Moffat. Clever, perhaps too clever for her station. We found her in the small library among the dust and resignation of catalogued order. She was shelving books with the distracted precision of the recently accused. There was something arresting about her, an air of intellect trying to disguise itself as obedience. When I told her we were looking into the matron's death, she nodded once, neither surprised nor afraid. She said she had liked the matron, then immediately corrected herself. A curious correction. Respect often masks resentment. I noticed a cup of tea on the desk, half finished, the ring it left on the paper still wet. I asked, as lightly as I could, whether that had been the matron's usual drink. Claire smiled faintly. Ordinary breakfast blend, she said, except that morning. Someone had fetched the pot from the staffroom, not her. She'd been in the archives, preparing a display for Founder's Day. She said it in the flat voice of a person who knows how alibis sound when spoken too soon. Lewis wandered through the shelves, tapping spines. He found a framed photograph on a high ledge of the matron in her younger years, standing beside the warden at a college fete. The two women looked like an allegory of duty, one stern, one smiling. I noticed that the photograph had been moved recently to a cleaner patch of dust on the wall behind it. Someone had taken it down, perhaps to look at, perhaps to hide. Before leaving, I borrowed a volume from the return tray, a collection of Hausmann's poems. Inside the cover, a faint pencil marks the laws of God, the laws of man. I could not decide whether it was underlined in admiration or warning. As we walked back through the quadrangle, the air felt heavy with unspoken things. Lewis said he couldn't imagine a quieter life than this tea at 10, chapel at 6, nothing much in between. I told him quiet lives often end in noisy ways. The chapel bell struck the hour behind us once, then once again. It was late afternoon, yet the sound felt identical to morning. Bells, like people, rarely change their tone. They only repeat themselves until someone finally listens. The kitchen at St. Agatha's was not a place one expected to find mystery. Steam rose from copper kettles, and the smell of flour hung in the air with the soft authority of habit. Everything gleamed with domestic obedience. Yet I have often found that the world's smallest crimes begin in such places where order disguises quiet rebellion, and a cup of tea can kill more discreetly than a pistol. Lewis had been questioning the cook, a broad woman with a complexion of honest labour. She told him that the matron had not poured her own tea that morning. The pot had come from the staffroom, as it always did, passed along by a junior maid whose name no one quite remembered. That, of course, was precisely what interested me. It is the half-forgotten hands that turn the wheel of fate. On the shelf above the stove there were 3 tins, one marked breakfast blend, another Earl Grey, and a third, newer one with its label half-peeled herbal infusion. The tin was empty. I asked how long it had been there. No one seemed to know. Claire Moffat, the librarian, had apparently brought it in weeks ago as a gift for the matron. Something soothing for the nerves. The cook said it with an edge of mockery that suggested no one at St. Agatha's had nerves worth soothing. Lewis noted down the names and moved on to more procedural questions. Visitors, deliveries, any sign of forced entry. I remained behind. My eyes followed the shine of the teaspoons arranged neatly beside the sink. 12 in total, each engraved with the college crest. I counted them again. 11. The absence of a 12th might have meant that spoons, like people, wander off easily. But the matron's saucer, I recalled, had been bare. There was a sound from the corridor, the faint clatter of a tray. Claire entered, her hair tied loosely, her expression composed but watchful. She looked at the tea tins as one might at a half-remembered dream. She said the matron liked her tea mild, with honey instead of sugar. She spoke softly, as though describing a ritual rather than a beverage. I asked when she had last seen her. She said 2 days before the death. They had quarrelled, she admitted, about the arrangement of a Founder's Day display. The matron had wanted modesty, Claire, something brighter. Her voice broke on the word bright. I did not press her. Guilt has a way of revealing itself through the effort of concealment. She left soon after, murmuring that she had books to tend. Lewis reappeared, holding a slip from the delivery ledger. A package had arrived that morning with no signature, no return address. He thought it might be the tea. I thought it might be something else entirely. The ledger's ink was faint, as though someone had written quickly and wiped at it before it dried. Outside, the college gardens were wet with early drizzle. I walked the narrow path between the kitchen and the refectory, thinking about substitutions. A pot was replaced, a tin refilled, a hand unseen. The college seemed to thrive on such quiet exchanges of secrets masquerading as routine. We met again with Dr. Vale in the hall. She asked whether we had made progress. I said only that the matron's last cup of tea had been prepared with remarkable care. The remark seemed to unsettle her. She adjusted her spectacles and said she had no patience for melodrama. I assured her that murder, when properly done, was the least melodramatic act of all. That evening, back at the station, I opened the Oxford Mail crossword. The clue that held me was a simple one. Change in routine, 7 letters. The answer came to me slowly, and with it, an odd clarity. Reform. I thought of Della Craythorne, the unbending matron who had governed her small empire through rules. Reform can be poisonous to those who live by order. When I closed my notebook, the smell of tea seemed to follow me. I could almost taste its faint bitterness, that uneasy mingling of comfort and deceit. Perhaps that is why I've always preferred whiskey. It tells you the truth quickly, sharply, without disguise. But tea makes you believe you are safe until the moment you aren't. It occurred to me as I sat once more in the matron's narrow office that order is a form of faith. Della Craythorne had worshipped it as others worship certainty, tidiness as creed, routine as prayer. Everything about the room confirmed it. The files were alphabetized, the desk bare save for an inkstand, and a calendar turned precisely to the right date. Even the dust had kept its distance out of respect. I could not help thinking how much comfort she must have taken from the notion that life could be kept clean by will alone. Lewis had gone to fetch statements from the kitchen staff. I stayed behind, leafing through the matron's ledgers. Each entry, written in a hand so disciplined it seemed to resent emotion. There were notes on linens, chapel rosters, lost umbrellas, even an account of broken crockery from 2 years prior. Beneath these banalities I found the faintest indentation of erased words, the ghost of a line rewritten. I rubbed the page lightly, and the letters surfaced. Disobedience, librarian warning issued. The librarian again, Claire Moffat. The name kept surfacing like a half-remembered refrain. The rain had started, soft and persistent, the kind Oxford rain that does not fall so much as inhabit the air. It streaked the window panes, turning the college gardens into a watercolour of restraint. Through the glass I could see a figure walking beneath an umbrella, Miss Anstice, the classics tutor. She paused, turned as though sensing observation, and disappeared under the cloister arch. I remembered the nurse mentioning that Anstice had once been reprimanded by the matron for keeping a male guest too long in her rooms. Another act of disobedience forgiven, but not forgotten. When Lewis returned, dripping and discontent, he reported that the staff remembered little beyond the ordinary. The matron's routine had been as reliable as the bell tower itself. She breakfasted at 8, visited the laundry by 9, tea at 11. A life carved into timetables. Lewis said he couldn't see how anyone could dislike her. That, I told him, was precisely why they might. Later that afternoon, I visited Claire in the library again. She was arranging a display of early hymnals, her fingers brushing each spine as though soothing old wounds. The room was cold and smelled faintly of polish and paper mould. I asked if she had been fond of Mrs. Craythorne. Claire smiled without warmth. Fondness, she said, wasn't the right word. She respected her, though not always her methods. The matron, she said, believed that cleanliness could cure sin. Her tone was bitter but quiet, like an accusation rehearsed too often. She offered me a letter unsigned, folded, and found in the library's suggestion box a week before her death. It read, "Only some rules deserve to be broken." The paper was fine, college stationery, the kind reserved for staff. I turned it over the back and bore a faint ring of moisture, the trace of a cup. Tea again, always tea. When I left, Claire's eyes followed me. Not pleading, but curious, as if she, too, were measuring me for untidiness. That evening I dined alone in my room. The rain had thickened, the sound of it like static against the glass. I poured a measure of whiskey, opened my crossword. The clue was, unbending virtue conceals in 9 letters. I stared at it for a long time. Rigidity, I thought. The answer fits, though not perfectly 1 letter off, perhaps, much like Della Craythorne herself. Before I go to sleep, I reread my notes. Every account of the matron spoke of discipline, loyalty, devotion, yet not one mentioned affection. Even Lewis, kind-hearted creature that he is, had found nothing to admire but her punctuality. A life of order, I thought, can protect one from chaos but never from loneliness. And loneliness, like dust, always returns no matter how carefully one cleans. I have often thought that truth hides best in the places meant for storage. The linen room at St. Agatha's was one of those small, windowless, thick, with the scent of starch and quiet endurance. I went there not expecting revelation, but seeking refuge from the chatter of officials. It was Lewis, as usual, who found the first clue without knowing it was one. He called from the far corner, holding a framed photograph wrapped in brown paper, its surface powdered with lint. A thing forgotten, but not lost. It showed a younger Della Craythorne, perhaps 25, standing beside a man in a porter's uniform, both framed by the arch of the main gate. The man's hand rested on her shoulder, not possessively, but familiarly. Behind them a table set for a fete bunting, teacups, flowers. The world before routine hardened into ritual. On the back, a faint inscription in an uncertain hand, Michael, 1959. The ink had bled slightly, as if someone had touched it with a damp thumb. I asked the housekeeper whether she knew the man. She shook her head. Most of the old staff were gone, she said, replaced, retired, or buried. But she remembered something else the matron used to keep that photograph in her room until about a year ago. Then, without comment, she had taken it down and sent it to the laundry with the soiled tablecloths. It struck me as a curious act, discarding memory in a place devoted to cleansing. Lewis thought little of it. Old romances, he said, always end in boxes, but I have never trusted the way people simplify the past. It rarely folds neatly. I held the photograph under the light. The matron's expression was not joyous, but cautious, the kind of half-smile one wears when the camera is an intruder. I noticed the teapot on the table behind her. Its design, white china with a faint blue vine pattern, matched the one found beside her at death. That coincidence clung to me like the smell of detergent in the room. There are moments in investigation when reason takes a step back and intuition advances uninvited. I found myself opening cupboards, drawers, even a wicker hamper that had not been touched in years. Inside, folded with near-military precision, lay the college linen sheets, tablecloths, altar covers. Between two of them, a slip of brittle paper. It was a bill of sale for a set of china, dated 3 months earlier, signed by Claire Moffat. The same pattern, the same teapot. Lewis frowned when I showed him. Perhaps she replaced a broken one, he suggested. Perhaps. But the handwriting on the receipt wasn't Claire's usual academic scrawl. I had seen her notes in the library margins. This one was smaller, more deliberate, as though copying rather than writing. I tucked the paper into my notebook, feeling a faint thrill I could not justify. When we returned to the quadrangle, the rain had stopped. The sun, diluted but insistent, had found its way through the cloister arches, turning the puddles into fragments of gold. Dr. Vale crossed the courtyard, a book under her arm. She asked if we had made progress. Lewis answered for both of us, some polite murmur about following leads. She smiled thinly, said that grief made people imagine conspiracies. Her tone had that polished calm particular to those who have much to hide and even more to lose. That night, I examined the photograph again in my flat. Michael's face. Michael seemed oddly familiar. Something in the slope of his jaw, the curve of the ear. I fetched the college yearbook from the file and found him among the staff portraits. Michael Penny, porter, deceased, 1961, cause accident. No details given. 2 years after the photograph. The matron would have been 27. I poured a whiskey, though it did little to clear the taste of irony. Love, I thought, is like linen, washed, folded, hidden away, yet never quite rid of its stains. Somewhere between the photograph and the teapot lay a substitution, a quiet exchange of old things for new, affection for duty. I could not yet say what it meant, but I knew the pattern would repeat itself, as it always does, when order demands to be preserved. It was Lewis who suggested we attend the lecture. He thought it might help us understand the sort of people we're dealing with. I said nothing, though I've never believed guilt can be explained from a podium. Still, St. Agatha's had advertised an evening talk by Dr. Leonora Vale, the warden herself, titled Moral Responsibility in Classical Tragedy. I have learned never to ignore a coincidence, especially when it announces itself so politely. The hall was half filled when we arrived. The air smelled of chalk and damp wool. A handful of students sat dutifully in the front row, their notebooks open but their attention elsewhere. Leonora stood at the lectern, a slender silhouette against the oak panels, her voice carrying not warmth but conviction. Guilt, she said, was the most democratic of human afflictions, the only emotion that refused extinction. It grows in silence, she added, and thrives on logic. I watched her fingers as she turned the pages of her notes, neat, unhurried, deliberate. Lewis fidgeted beside me. He has always distrusted words when spoken too beautifully. I, on the other hand, distrust those who use them as armour. Leonora spoke of Orestes, of Agamemnon's blood, of sins inherited through love. She paused often, not to breathe, but to listen for her own echo. When the applause came, it sounded half-hearted, the audience relieved more than moved. Afterwards, she saw me waiting by the door. I congratulated her on the lecture, the kind of empty civility one extends to the guilty. She asked if the investigation was progressing. I told her it was advancing in circles, which was more truth than she deserved. She smiled, though her eyes did not follow suit. Guilt, I said, quoting her own words, must be very democratic at St. Agatha's. That earned me the smallest tightening at the corner of her mouth. Outside, the rain had returned, drumming faintly against the cloister glass. Lewis went to find the car while I lingered in the vestibule. On a notice board, a new posting caught my attention. A schedule for staff duties. The matron's signature, D. Craythorne, appeared beside an inspection date crossed out in red. Beneath it, in Leonora's handwriting, the word postponed. I felt a small click of thought, like the turning of a safe's dial. Later that night, back at the station, the coroner's preliminary report arrived. Traces of digitalis in the bloodstream are enough to still a heart within minutes. Digitalis derived from foxglove, a plant common in English gardens, even more so in the beds of St. Agatha's Chapel. Lewis thought of an accident, a careless brewing of herbs. He said the matron could have mistaken it for herself. I nodded, though inwardly I felt the old irritation of false simplicity. The matron was many things, but careless was not one of them. I returned to my flat around midnight. The rain had stopped, but left the air heavy, perfumed with wet stone. I poured a whiskey and sat at my desk, the report spread before me. Digitalis. I remembered something from the linen room photograph. The faint blur of violet blossoms behind the porter's gate, the same hue as foxglove. Memory, like guilt, blooms in peculiar places. There was a crossword half-finished beside my glass. The clue read, "Sin concealed." Within order, 8 letters. I filled it in without hesitation. Disguise. It seemed almost mocking. The phone rang. Lewis, apologetic for the hour. He'd checked the college garden inventory, and a note recorded one mislabeled specimen, foxglove entered as Angel's trumpet. He sounded triumphant. I only said that angels, too, have their poisons. After he hung up, I found myself thinking again of Leonora Vale, her poise, her calm, the precision of her speech. There is something cruel in certain kinds of intelligence, the kind that believes emotion can be corrected through reason. Perhaps she envied Della Craythorne's tyranny of order, perhaps feared it. The difference between envy and fear, I've found, is merely duration. I turned out the light. Through the open window came the faint toll of the chapel bell, a single note striking the air and fading into nothing. In Oxford, even guilt learns to keep its voice low. It was late afternoon when Miss Anstice came to see me. The porter had announced her with the kind of subdued satisfaction that attends scandals. St. Agatha's thrived on secrets, and this one promised to be delicious. She stood in the doorway like a misplaced comma, hesitant, necessary, easily overlooked. Her face had the drawn calm of someone rehearsed in guilt. She said she wished to clear her conscience. I've learned to distrust that phrase. A clear conscience is merely a well-argued lie. Still I listened. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with precision, each word arranged like a relic in glass. She confessed to changing the matron's tea that morning. She had, she said, intended kindness. Della Craythorne had seemed pale, and she'd thought a herbal brew might soothe her heart. The word heart lingered too long. She insisted she had no idea the mixture could harm. Lewis, ever literal, leaned forward in his chair, his pen already recording every syllable. I watched instead the woman herself, the way her hands gripped her bag, white at the knuckles, her eyes fixed not on us, but on the photograph of the Radcliffe camera hanging behind my desk. Guilt, I've noticed, never looks at its audience. It prefers architecture. When she finished, Lewis asked why she'd waited so long to come forward. She said she'd hoped it might all be an accident, that the coroner would rule it natural. But when she'd overheard talk of poison, she could no longer sleep. It sounded plausible, practiced even. I asked which tin she had used for the tea. The one marked herbal infusion, she replied. It had been left in the staffroom, unsealed. Her story fitted the facts too neatly. No hesitation, no contradiction, only the faint tremor of artifice. People rarely confess to such symmetry. I asked a final question. Had she known Claire Moffat well? A pause, then the faintest flush. They'd worked together often, she said, though the matron had not approved. I thanked her and promised to make a note for the file. When she left, Lewis exhaled as though the case had ended. I envied his simplicity, that clean relief in the face of confession. But I have long since learned that truth rarely introduces itself. It waits to be mistaken for something else. We walked back to the college through drizzle. The stone paths gleamed like mirrors, reflecting spires into puddles. Lewis said the woman had looked genuine enough. I told him sincerity was a poor measure of honesty. He frowned, uncertain whether it was an insult or a lesson. In the chapel vestibule, we encountered Dr. Vale. She asked after our progress, her tone polite to the point of mockery. I mentioned that Miss Anstice had spoken to us. The warden's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but there it was, a brief tightening around the eyes, as if she'd tasted something bitter. She said Anstice was a fragile soul, inclined to melodrama, and that her affection for the librarian had perhaps blurred her judgment. It was said with sympathy, but the kind of sympathy that wounds. That night I replayed the conversation in my mind. There had been one detail that clung uncomfortably to Miss Anstice's description of the tin unsealed. The cook had told us earlier the tins were always kept closed, and that morning she herself had tidied the shelf. So either the cook had lied, or someone had opened it after. I preferred the latter. On my desk lay the Times crossword. I stared at a clue for a long time. Kindness, mistaken, may end in harm, 9 letters. The answer, when it came, was compassion. It seemed fitting. I poured a whiskey and thought of Miss Anstice, her trembling voice, her hands twisting like paper. If she was lying, it was not to hide murder, but to protect someone else. There was no triumph in that deduction, only sadness. The kind of sadness that smells faintly of damp stone and old hymns, the scent of Oxford at dusk. I left the office light burning that night. Not because I expected revelation, but because guilt, once summoned, dislikes the dark. The library at St. Agatha's had a sound particular to itself, a hushed pulse of paper and dust, as if the books were quietly breathing in the dark. I went there after hours when the corridors were empty and the rain against the windows sounded like someone turning pages very slowly. Lewis had gone home, convinced that nothing more could be done that evening. I have never found rest a useful habit when the truth is still unshelved. The porter had lent me his key, half reluctantly, and I promised to lock up after. It was past 9 when I entered. The air was cool and faintly scented with polish and decay. Somewhere beyond the stacks a clock ticked with the slow patience of an old tutor marking essays. I had no clear purpose in being there, only the quiet certainty that the dead sometimes leave their confessions between the lines. I began with the librarian's desk. Claire's handwriting was everywhere small, elegant, and too deliberate. She had left her notes in tidy row succession. Numbers, donor names, restoration dates. I traced one line with my finger and stopped at an entry for a missing index card. C. Craythorne, Della. Removed, no replacement. I checked the drawer itself. There was a small absence, perfectly shaped. Behind it, something caught my eye, a folded slip of paper, yellowed by age and oil from fingers not long dead. I unfolded it beneath the lamplight. The writing was careful, almost ornamental. Forgive me, but the truth will out. No signature, only the faintest impression of a college crest pressed into the paper as though sealed once and broken later. It might have been Della's hand, though I wasn't certain. There was a steadiness to the lines that felt too controlled for panic, too composed for plea. I pocketed it, feeling the familiar weight of words that refused to explain themselves. The rain grew heavier outside, filling the air with a kind of moving silence. I wandered to the far alcove, the one overlooking the chapel roof. The glass there was fogged, and beneath it sat a kettle, a relic from when the library had housed the staff lounge. Its spout gleamed faintly in the lamplight, a useless thing still pretending to serve. I touched it absently and found it warm. Someone had been here recently. I turned off the lamp and listened. The faint echo of footsteps, perhaps, or only the settling of timber. It was easy to mistake guilt for company in such places. Yet I could not shake the sense of proximity, a presence that had left seconds before. A faint scent of perfume lingered, sharp and medicinal, the same note I had noticed once on Dr. Vale's gloves. I returned to the desk, the slip of paper still in my pocket. Beneath it lay a register of borrowed volumes. One entry had been scratched out, but the pressure of the pen had left a ghost trace. I tilted the page to the light and read it. Houseman, selected poems. Checked out 3 days before the death. Borrower's initials, LV the warden. Again. I sat there a long time, the library holding its breath around me. It was not discovery that disturbed me, but confirmation of the pattern revealing itself too elegantly, too tragically. The same book that Claire had quoted from, misquoted, as if the words had passed through another's memory before reaching her own. Knowledge transferred, distorted like a confession, retold until truth wore another's voice. When I finally rose, the rain had ceased. The night pressed close against the windows, and the reflection staring back from the glass looked older than I remembered. I locked the door behind me, the echo of the key sharp in the corridor. Somewhere above, the bell struck 10, each note a reminder that time, too, keeps its own record. Back at my flat, I laid the paper on my desk beside the coroner's report, the photograph, and the invoice fragments of a story not yet whole. I poured a whiskey, but it tasted of the same thing as the air in that library order: guilt and something faintly burnt. I have always trusted silence more than words, but that night even silence seemed to accuse. Memory, like poetry, is a dangerous editor. It keeps the rhythm but changes the meaning. I realized this late one night when a misquoted verse returned to me with the quiet insistence of conscience. Claire Moffat, in her nervous way, had spoken those words days earlier. It's like Hausmann said, the heart out of its grief must give birth to something sweet. I nodded at the time, distracted. Now, alone in my flat with a stack of notes and the smell of whiskey for company, the line surfaced again, and with it, the faint irritation of error. Hausmann never wrote it. It was the kind of small discrepancy that can rattle a mind attuned to imbalance. I fetched the collected poems from the shelf and turned the pages slowly, the familiar ache of his lines unfolding loss, regret, the old English disease of endurance. But the phrase Claire used wasn't there. What I did find was something close, yet darker. Out of the dark of night, flowers bloom in poisoned soil. It was less about sweetness than survival, and I remembered suddenly it had been misquoted before, by Leonora Vale. The warden had used that very phrase in her lecture on guilt, the same rhythm, the same rearrangement of meaning, guilt reborn as beauty. It struck me then Claire hadn't quoted Hausmann at all. She had quoted Leonora, words borrowed, recycled, perhaps unconsciously, or perhaps not. The next morning, I walked through the college gardens. The rain had stopped, leaving the paths slick and reflective. Foxglove leaves still glistened from the downpour, their edges dark as bruises. Lewis met me at the gate, cheerful in that way only the untroubled can be. He said the coroner's report had arrived at the precise amount of digitalis measured, fatal within minutes. I asked where the plant had grown. He pointed to the border near the chapel wall. The matron's favourite bed, he said. She tended it herself. I asked him to fetch the staff records again, delivery orders, purchases, anything that might show who had brought that tea into the college. He went, puzzled, but obliging. Alone, I lit a cigarette and watched the smoke curl upward, dissolving into the pale light. The chapel bell sounded distantly, that same dull tone I had heard on the morning of her death. It rang with the resigned rhythm of ritual one note, repeating what it could never undo. Later, in the warden's study, I mentioned the misquote. Leonora smiled faintly, as though at a child who had learned a clever trick. I asked if she remembered using the line before. She said it was possible poetry was not her field. Then, too casually, she added that she might have seen it once scribbled in Della Craythorne's handwriting. The matron, she said, had enjoyed copying verses into her diary, though her taste had been sentimental. It was an odd remark, both intimate and distancing. I asked if she had ever read the diary herself. She hesitated, the pause of someone editing thought before speech. Only after her death, she said. The executors had shown her certain passages, for the sake of college discretion. When I left, I noticed a book on her desk, the collected poems of A.E. Housman, open to a page I knew too well. The same misquoted line underlined in pencil, faint but deliberate. The mark of someone revisiting a lie. That evening, back in my flat, I worked through the puzzle as one might a crossword, not for amusement, but to quiet the noise of incompleteness. The clues were modest, domestic things. A teapot replaced, a photograph moved, a misquote carried from one woman's mouth to another's. Between them, a chain of small intimacies that formed something poisonous and human. I did not yet know the full truth, only its shape, a pattern of pride, loyalty, and the kind of forgiveness that kills. Outside, the rain began again, steady and unhurried, the city returning to its element. I closed the book and sat in silence, the echo of that false line whispering through me. It was never sweetness that followed grief. It is clear, sharp as foxglove, and just as fatal. There are few moments lonelier than the one before a confession. The air itself grows watchful, as though waiting to see whether truth will prove heavier than silence. That was how it felt when I returned to St. Agatha's the following morning, summoned, though not invited, by Dr. Leonora Vale. Her message had been brief. She wished to speak privately. The words carried the sort of politeness one reserves for a final act. The warden's study was a room built for containment. Dark wood, disciplined curtains, shelves arranged with the moral precision of a mind unwilling to be surprised. A single teacup sat before her on the desk, steam curling upward like something rehearsed. She gestured to the chair opposite. I sat without comment. She began without a preamble. She said she knew why I had come. There was no hostility in her tone, only the resignation of someone who has discovered that control, however artful, is a temporary state. She spoke of the matron of Della Craythorne's devotion, her tyranny, her taste for correction. She said they had once been close, though close was not the word she meant. They had shared a secret, she said. Then, more softly, a disappointment. Her eyes moved to the teacup. She told me she had intended to forgive her that morning, to pour tea as a gesture, not of reconciliation, but of civility, the fragile kind that conceals hurt rather than healing it. She had prepared the pot herself, using the herbal blend she had once given Della as a peace offering. A trivial act of kindness, or so she had believed. I said nothing. Silence is often kinder than disbelief. She continued the story unfolding in that calm, deliberate cadence I had come to recognize as her defense against feeling. She remembered pouring the tea, remembered watching the matron drink it, slowly, too slowly. And then a sudden faintness, a confusion of breath, the body folding forward as though bowing to an unseen command. Leonora had frozen, she said, not from shock but from comprehension. She had realized what she'd done only when it was too late to undo it. Digitalis, the mislabeled plant, the same leaves she had crushed into the blend weeks earlier, believing them harmless. A scholar's mistake, she said, a careless gardener's ignorance. I looked at her hands. They trembled slightly as she poured a second cup. For herself this time. She offered none to me. The gesture was ceremonial, a performance of composure in a room that smelled faintly of fear and tea. I asked her one question: why keep the misquote alive? She paused, smiled almost tenderly. Because, she said, it was the only way to speak of guilt without naming it. The heart out of its grief must give birth to something sweet. A lie, of course, but one she had preferred to the original. Lewis would have wanted an arrest, a statement, a charge, a conclusion that could be typed and filed. But I saw no triumph in her confession, only symmetry. The matron's order had ended where it began, in the ritual of tea, in a correction gone too far. When I left the college, the bell was tolling again, its sound flat against the mist. I stopped at the gate and looked back. Through the window I could see Leonora standing by her desk, the cup still in her hand. She raised it slightly as if to salute some invisible witness, then turned away. I would later learn she had resigned that afternoon. No trial, no scandal, only an absence carefully folded into the college minutes. Back at my flat I poured a whiskey and thought of her face, not the confession, but the moment before it when she decided that truth, like tea, must be served hot or not at all. The city outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes one aware of every small sound, the drip of a tap, the settling of floorboards, the faint rattle of leaves against glass. Oxford has many ghosts. Most of them, I've found, are perfectly alive, sitting alone somewhere, nursing a cup that's gone cold, whispering lines they half remember, and believing them true. It was weeks later before the quiet settled. Cases end, or so they say, but endings are an administrative illusion. What truly ends in Oxford? The bells continue, the papers keep printing obituaries, and the rain never quite decides to leave. I told Lewis the file was closed. I even wrote the report myself, neat, concise, and mercifully official. Yet the case never left me. It simply learned to whisper instead of speak. Outside, a bicycle bell chimed in the lane, brief, unrepentant. I remembered the other bell, the one at St. Agatha's, how it had been tolled on that first morning, summoning me not to pray but to order. It rang the same way now in memory, slow, deliberate, unchanged. The city holds its echoes far better than its people. Lewis asked what I thought of Leonora Vale, whether she'd meant it the confession he meant. I told him that intention was the least reliable truth. She had not set out to kill, but guilt is not measured by motive, it is measured by how long a person can live with silence. He didn't quite understand, though he tried. That too I envied. After he left I lingered. The beer had gone flat and the crossword lay half-finished beside it. One clue kept drawing my eye. After the end, something remains of 7 letters. I stared at it for a long time before filling in the word residue. It seemed an adequate summary of both the case and myself. I walked back through the narrow streets where lamplight leaned on puddles and the smell of wet brick rose like old breath. My steps carried me, without decision, toward college, habit, or maybe compulsion. The porter on duty recognized me and said nothing, only nodded toward the quad. The chapel windows glowed faintly, and the air inside the gates felt heavier than the city beyond, as though St. Agatha's refused to exhale. I stood outside the matron's office. The blinds were drawn now, the desk cleared, the room anonymous. Only the faint mark of a teacup remained on the varnish, pale as an old scar. I rested my hand beside it. The wood was cool, but in memory it still felt warm. The investigation had explained much, but not everything. It never does. Leonora's confession was eloquent, remorseful, and I suspect incomplete. There had been another cup that morning, hers poured with the same ceremony, untouched after the matron's collapse. A twin gesture, a private symmetry. She had said she'd poured it out later. I had believed her, perhaps because I wanted to. I walked slowly toward the chapel. The smell of foxglove still clung to the border walls, faint but recognizable, a sweetness sharpened by decay. The flowers were beginning to wilt, their color fading from violet to bone. Nature, I thought, tidies up better than men ever do. Inside, the air was still. I sat for a while beneath the bell tower, watching the dust drift through the beam of a single lamp. The city outside murmured with life, indifferent as ever. I realized then that I was tired not from work, but from knowing too much about the ways people break each other gently. When I finally rose to leave, the sound of rain began again, soft and deliberate. I imagined Leonora somewhere far from Oxford, sitting alone in a small room, a cup cooling before her. Not tea, perhaps, maybe nothing at all. Somewhere between forgiveness and truth lies the silence that follows confession. That is where I've lived ever since, in the residue of it, with the cup still warm in memory,